So we've been looking at market failures. The perfectly competitive market not working perfectly. And because of this, we are not allocatively efficient. We're not using scarce resources to produce what society wants the most. So just a quick recap. What was the market failure? Why is it a problem? And what is the solution? So we had public goods. And the problem is the free rider problem. So it is underproduced. The quantity is too low. And the solution is to pay for it with taxes. What was the second market failure? The second market failure was common goods. The problem is what? Tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons causes overconsumption. And the solution was licenses on hunting and fishing, quotas, and other legislative controls. Right, we talked about a hunting and fishing department, a wild game department within the government. So oversight, legislative controls. All right, the third market failure was what? Negative externalities. The problem with negative externalities is we're hurting people who are not the buyers or the sellers. So the quantity being produced is not the optimal quantity. We have overproduction. We'd like that quantity to be lower. So what's the solution? Well, how do you get people to internalize that external cost? You can have an excise tax. You can alternatively have legislative controls, quotas on production or pollution, or you can have a cap and trade, a secondary market for permits, cap and trade. All right, so that puts us at number 4. We are now looking at positive externalities. External benefits, when people who are not the buyer or the seller benefit from the production or consumption. Well, the problem this creates is that the quantity is not the optimal quantity. If people are benefiting from the production or consumption, we'd like the quantity to be higher. Okay. So the quantity set by supply and demand is not the optimal amount. So what is the solution? Well, here we have demand and supply. The price and the quantity are based on the impact to the buyer and the seller. And so we can look at an example such as college education. So the price of college education is based on the value to the student in terms of future job opportunities and the extra cost to provide that service. So supply is from the marginal cost curve. So it's the extra cost of the business to make the good or provide the service. And then demand is the value to the customer. That's what determines the price of education. But we need to take into consideration that being an educated population, having a college or university in your town has a benefit to the community. It means lower unemployment, more job opportunities, more businesses start up. We have a lower crime rate. We see more economic growth within that area. So we benefit even though we're not the people who are providing the education or the students getting the education. And so we need a way to internalize that external benefit. So we can add to this graph a line that we call the marginal social benefit curve. So remember that demand curve is the marginal benefit, the extra benefit to the individual, the value of having that particular good or service. So the marginal social benefit curve takes that value to the individual who's getting the education and adds to it the external benefit. So now we have not just the value to the person getting the education, but the value to the greater society as well. If we can find a way to internalize that external benefit, then what that should do is that should increase the number of people going to college. That market equilibrium is now at a higher quantity. Okay, so how do we go about internalizing that impact on the rest of society? How do we internalize that marginal social benefit? Well, there are a couple options to deal with this. Solution number one. Solution number one is to create quasi-public goods. And what was the definition of a quasi-public good? It was a private good that we treat as public. So remember, one of the reasons for having a quasi-public good is because there's an external benefit. It helps people who are not the buyers and the sellers. And so one example we had looked at was vaccines, right? We could sell vaccines, you could pay for it, in which case the price would be based on the cost to make it and the value to the individual getting the vaccine. But because you having a flu vaccine means I'm less likely to get the flu, we want that quantity to be higher. One way to do that is to pay for it with taxes. So we pay for things with our taxes, right? So if you look at CBC radio and television, it's partly paid for by taxes. When we look at public transportation, half of the cost of the ride is paid for with taxes. Healthcare, postal service, these all receive taxpayer money. So we can provide it as a quasi-public good. So this could be completely funded by taxes. Or we can have a subsidy where it is partly funded by taxes. Okay. So we can fully fund it or we can partially fund it. Public transportation is typically 50-50. Half of it is paid for by taxes. Half of it is paid for by the rider. Your education is partially funded by taxpayers. So when you go and pay your tuition, you're not paying the full amount of the cost to provide the education. So we can fully fund it or we can partially fund it. The idea with subsidies is that the subsidy, the amount of the subsidy, is equal to the external benefit. So if we go back to our graph here, this vertical difference was the amount of the external benefit. We could have the subsidy be equal to that external benefit, the extra value to the rest of society, and that would get us to a higher quantity of people accessing vaccines, education, whatever has the external benefit. Okay, so let's look at some things that we subsidize. So what do we subsidize in Canada? We subsidize dairy farmers, corn producers, automotive production, airplane manufacturing, childcare, education, transportation. Okay. We also subsidize energy production. So here you see on this graph, energy subsidies in various countries. So these are non-OECD countries. We are an OECD country. OECD is an organization of Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. These countries that are OECD are the competitive economies, These are the non-OECD countries, so they're less competition-based economies, more command-based. So notice these countries subsidize energy, and we do as well. So we want to do a bit of a comparison. How much do they subsidize? How much do we subsidize? So in Iran, you can see, for example, that there's large subsidies on oil and gas. So if you are in Iran, you're paying about 25 cents a liter for gas. The rest of the costs for gas is paid for through taxes. Now, how much do we subsidize things like oil and gas? Well, in Canada, we spend about $3 billion on oil subsidies. Collectively, the G20 countries spend about $450 billion a year on fossil fuel subsidies. Now, we said we spend about $3 billion on oil and gas. How do you think that compares to the US? Well, the US spends about $24 billion a year on all energy subsidies. Ethanol is the one they spend the most on in terms of subsidies at $6 billion. The US spends about $2.5 billion on oil. So Canada subsidizes oil production more than the US, even though the US has 10 times the population. So we spend a lot of money subsidizing the oil industry. So why would we do that? Why would Iran subsidize the oil industry? Well, let's think about Alberta. We've been talking lately about providing incentives for more production of natural gas, more subsidies. Why? Well, remember that, let's find our blank page here. Here's demand, here's supply. This price and quantity are based on the cost to the business and the value to the customer. So if we're talking about natural gas or we're talking about oil, it's those who use it and those who make it. Well, in Alberta, if we have an economy highly dependent on energy jobs in oil and natural gas, then the rest of our society is benefiting if there's more production of oil and natural gas, because that means that the people in our town have jobs, they're working, they're then buying TVs and staying in hotels and going to restaurants. So in Alberta, we subsidize energy production because we want more production to create more jobs in our economy. The other reason we subsidize energy is we want it to be affordable, because if it costs too much to drive, then you're not going to go out to the restaurant. And it means that the cost is a lot higher to businesses. The grocery store can't get the apples to the grocery store if it costs too much for gas. So the reason we subsidize energy, particularly oil and gas, is because we want the quantity to go up. We want the price to go down to the customer. But notice when I look at this graph here, it looks like the price is going up. So if we subsidize things like gas so that it's cheaper for the customer, it doesn't seem to be showing up that way on our graph. So what is going on here? Well, it depends on whether you give the subsidy to the customer or to the business. If we give the subsidy to the customer, we're essentially writing a check to a household, the buyer, and we often do that in the form of a tax credit. So we give you the subsidy in terms of a tax credit, and the idea is to get you to purchase more. So we had our demand. Here's our marginal social benefit, our MSB. Okay. And so this vertical difference here is the amount of the subsidy or tax credit. So what it does is increases demand. Now we know that when demand increases, what happens to the price? Well, we can see here that our new equilibrium is at a higher price. Well, if we're giving the subsidy, we're writing a check to the customer, or we're giving them a tax credit, yes, there's an increase in demand, but is the customer paying a higher price? Well, what the customer is paying is here. The actual price for the service or the good, so if we're subsidizing gas and giving tax credits to the customers, the price is here, but the customer is paying this value, and the difference is what the government is paying, either through a tax credit or giving the check to the customer, being reimbursed. So the quantity goes up. We fix the issue we were talking about in terms of, let's go back, positive externalities, they're underproduced. We want the quantity to go up. So we've achieved that. The price is lower for those who are subsidized. The cost to the government is this shaded area here. It is the amount of the subsidy right? That's that vertical difference here times our new higher quantity, right? We went from Q1 here to Q2. So the cost of the government is the subsidy, so that's per unit, times the number of units sold. The cost is this area here. The individual who receives the subsidy or the tax credit pays the lower price. The benefit of this is that the consumer has choice. They have economic freedom. They can decide who to buy from. So if we're giving you a tax credit on the purchase of gas, you decide if you're going to buy from Shell or Esso. We do this type of subsidy, or at least we used to, with the child fitness credit. So we used to have a tax credit, it has since expired in 2016. And this child fitness credit gave a tax credit to families whose kids took sports. And the idea here is that rather than the government saying, you play soccer, we'll pay for it, it is the family can choose. Is the kid going to do soccer or hockey or ballet? They receive a tax credit which lowers the cost, so they're not paying the full market price, okay, which encourages them to do more fitness. And the idea here was to encourage more children to be involved in sports to help fight child obesity. So we can see the cost to the government. Those who receive the subsidy or the tax credit pay this lower price. We get the quantity to go up. The downside to subsidizing the consumer is what if you don't receive the subsidy? So what if you, for example, are a foreigner living in Canada? You don't get the tax credit. And so you pay the higher price. So the benefit of the subsidy going to the customer is choice. The downside is that individuals who don't receive the subsidy pay a higher price than before the subsidy. Now, if you receive the subsidy, you pay the lower price. So what we often do in Canada, rather than subsidizing the consumer, is we will subsidize the producer, the business. Okay. So here, we still have that marginal social benefit curve. We're still trying to take into consideration the value to everyone else, but we're not adding it to the customer. We are subtracting the cost from the business. So what we do is we take the marginal cost curve, that's the cost to the business, and we pay the subsidy to the business. The idea here is that if we lower the cost to the business, then they will produce more. We subsidize not the customer when it comes to oil and gas, but we subsidize the producer, the companies that are producing the oil and gas. When it comes to your education, rather than giving you a check to decide which college you go to, the subsidy goes to the college itself. The college gets grant funding or base funding from the province. So what we're doing here is lowering the cost to the business. We're making that marginal cost go down. So then we have a new supply curve. And this new supply curve is that supply plus the amount of the subsidy. So this vertical difference here is still the amount of the subsidy, but we're changing the cost to the business by giving them the money. The cost to the government is still the same. No change here. It's still the subsidy times, take that back. It's still the amount of the subsidy times the quantity sold. And the reason the box I just drew is wrong is because what happens to the quantity sold? Well, what's the whole point of subsidizing? It is to get the quantity to go up. Okay. So we get the quantity to go up. So the cost to the government hasn't changed because it's the amount of the subsidy, that's that vertical difference, times the quantity sold. And if my green line lined up properly, I'd be on that marginal social benefit curve right there. Okay, so the cost to the government isn't different. It's no different whether you subsidize the producer or the consumer. Okay, the quantity increase is the same, regardless of which one we do. The difference here is you no longer have choice because the government is giving the money to the business. So you can't choose which business. The government's handing over that money. You have no choice in this scenario, but the benefit of it is that everyone pays the lower price. Notice here, because we're making the cost go down for the business, that lower price gets passed on to all consumers. Whereas previous, it only went to the customers who received the subsidy, right? It was this piece right here. The benefit of going to the producer is that it's a lower price for all. So we're doing a subsidy in order to get the quantity to go up because there's a benefit to people who are not the buyers or the sellers. We want to get onto that marginal social benefit curve, right? These should have lined up there. So we're taking into consideration the full impact, not just on the customer and the business, but on the greater society. So we had mentioned that education is subsidized. So in 2020, if you are in your first year in the business administration diploma at Red Deer College, tuition and fees, you're paying about $4,700 if you are from around here. International students do not receive the subsidy. So notice that if you're an international student for the same program, you're paying almost $15,000 versus $5,000. So 3 times as much. The difference between the two, the subsidy. So remember, we are subsidizing. Now, in this case, we can price discriminate. We'll talk about that in a later class where we can charge different prices to different people. So we're not giving the subsidy to you, the student. We are giving it to the college, the producer. But in this case, it's not a lower price for all because we're actually able to separate into separate markets, the local student and the international student. So we'll talk about price discrimination in one of our next videos. But you can see the impact of the subsidy here simply in the difference in the prices. Now, across Canada, so just for your own interest, In 2020, a Canadian attending a Canadian college or university pays about $6,500, whereas an international student not being subsidized pays about $32,000. In the US, there are also subsidies for education. So if you are from a state, you pay taxes in that state, you get a subsidy when you go to school in that state. So in 2020, and this has been converted into Canadian dollars, you're paying about $13,000 a year if you go to a school in a state where you've paid taxes before. So you're receiving the most subsidies. If you live in one state growing up and you go to a school in a different state, you receive federal subsidies, but not state subsidies. So you're paying about $28,000. If you go to a private college or university, you are not receiving state or federal subsidies. You're paying about $46,000. And if you're going to Yale, most expensive institution in the US, you're paying about $76,000 Canadian a year, not including books and housing. Harvard is about $65,000. So at play here with those private institutions, right, we have demand, we have a limited or decreasing supply in terms of number of seats, increasing demand in terms of students. That impacts the price. But the reason I show you here the in-state, out-of-state, and private is so you can see the impact of state subsidies and federal subsidies. In Canada, we can see the difference between those who are subsidized in the province and those who are not. So let's go back to the list where we started this all. We said our market failure was positive externalities. The problem is underproduction. We want that quantity to be higher because other people benefit who are not the buyer and the seller. And your options are you can have quasi-public goods. Oop. Keep changing pens here. We have quasi-public goods. So things like vaccines, we fully fund through taxpayer money. Option number 2 is subsidies. They can go to the buyer or the seller. They both increase the quantity. The difference is the price for the non-subsidized and the amount of choice. All right, we're going to continue this list of market failures in the next couple of videos, looking at the rest of the market failures that occur when we are not allocatively efficient.